Alright, let's get through this. I'm updating about 6 years ago when I was starting my channel. I started off by comparing and just showing the variety of similar or what you think is the same tools, like breaker bars here. I happen to have 30 3/8 inch, what are known as hinge handle or hinge head breaker bars. Anyway, been going and updating my videos. It's been 6 years later, and I've been collecting for all those years. Really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing to the channel. It certainly has helped encourage me and given me incentive to try to build out the collection just to be able to do comparison videos. Earlier, they were kind of like mix and match, where I just would do all my 1/2 inch and 3/8 together, but now I have enough to do dedicated videos. I just did a few videos ago about my 1/2 inch drive hinge head or breaker bar collection. I actually have, of course, some similar brands as well as different brands. Certainly more, I would say, variety, maybe not more, but certainly ones that are different than from the 1/2 inch. So this is the old 18 inch Pittsburgh for a while. I don't know if they still sell it, but it was a 1/2 inch breaker bar that just had been machined down to 3/8. So it was just the Super Duty Harbor Freight 3/8 breaker bar. And whoop, shamefully, I have 3 of the Icon ones. I bought one of these new, and for a while, at least at the beginning of when Icon came out, if people would buy it, return it, probably buyer's remorse, probably end up getting the cheaper Pittsburghs when they did that. But if the little, hanging package was broken open, they would put them on a discount shelf. So I ended up buying these 2 soft grips. I believe that's how, when I always forget, at a discount. Now, if it looks like it's new on the Icon tools, they actually just zip tie it back to the shelf hanger and sell it at the new price. The only Icon tools that I've seen now that are in discount are like sets of torque sockets and things where they've warranted one out, and so it's just the remaining sockets. Anyway, Icon initially had this style handle, but it was the same color scheme as the Pittsburgh, so they came out with the inverse handle. And then, of course, this is just the non-comfort grip version. These are nice, like 14 inch, 12, 14 inch breaker bars. They really hold up pretty well, to tell you the truth. Pretty strong. They're actually reasonable, quality and durability for the price. And to tell you the truth, there's still some along some of my better and longer handle breaker bars. Besides that one Pittsburgh, these Icons are as long as like this Tech 10 or this Power Torque here, or whatever this random one is, this long handle Proto. They really are Snap-on-esque with the little round anvils. Anyway, I'm taking too long here. We will talk about the O'Reilly's Auto Parts Power Torque unit. Pretty standard unit. This one's halfway decent because it has a center ball detent. Has really squared off forks. I never really understood why they didn't round those forks off a little bit more. Probably because more grinding means more money, so they're trying to save money wherever they could. Basic anvil design, but at least they fattened it up where the screw goes through, so there isn't too much of a reduction of metal there. Kind of like this funky fluted handle, and it is an extension style, which is always nice because a little bit of extra money for to forge that in there, but then you get 2 tools in one, a nice long extension, as well as a breaker bar. And then here's the Tecton. Nearly the same thing. I mean, chrome vanadium steel 18 inch or 12 inch breaker bars are what they are, to tell you the truth. We have 2 Craftsmans here. I haven't really been much to collecting these, but I did notice both of these were in the same bin, but I noticed they both were the same I-beam style Craftsmans. Old school, they use a swaged rivet instead of a screw. In the old days, they'd rely on those rivets to help try to prevent the forks from spreading, to add a little more strength in them. More modern ones, they just use a screw and use the screw threads to perform the same task and allow a lot more ease in replacing the anvil if it breaks. Many breaker bars are designed to snap the anvil before the fork breaks, but sometimes the fork breaks. What's interesting is this is like an old V-series, and this slightly newer V-series where it actually has a part number, but the old Craftsman ones, when they don't have a part number on them. Anyway, we have a few Protos here. We have Actually, we'll compare a couple of challengers here. These are both 1270s, but one is the original Challenger before Proto bought them, and you can see the difference in the font, to the newer Challenger. When Proto first bought them, they actually put "by Proto," which I thought was amusing. I like them because they're old Challengers. This one, the friction ring or whatever happened is totally gone out of it. This one, the center detent is still there. But you can see how I think these are a little bit cheesy, because this is a 3/8 square and it isn't bulged out. They didn't add any extra material, so there's this big hole right through the middle of the back of this, so they're really relying heavily on the forks. And I'll have to say the forks do have quite a bit of material, but nonetheless, these are ones where, you know, the fork can spread out a little bit and it will rotate and actually shear the pin off. They're just not a particularly great design, and this one actually looks like it's been had a lot of load put on it, and the forks are already a little bit spread out, and maybe that's why it doesn't have any friction. But for a decent name like Challenger, I was really kind of surprised that they didn't have the best build quality. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting to have, for tool history, to have the same tool, the same part number, but before and after getting bought out. Like this long handle one, this is an actual genuine Proto branded one, but it's the same thing. I mean, I think it maybe has a slightly stronger pin in it, but still it isn't expanded out. It just kind of seems, for, especially for a long handle breaker bar, but that this whole anvil situation, it just isn't super great. Kind of disappointing. And it seems that later on they finally started making machine ones where they are more bulged out. That provides two things. One, it gives more strength to the back end of the anvil itself, and secondly, it's a more surface area, so to offset in the forks, so the forks actually end up taking less stress. Continuing on, we'll do both of the snap-ons. I have one really old school genuine snap-on F10L. We even have our patents on this. Surprisingly enough, I can't believe that Snap-on actually ended up having a patent for the hinge head breaker bar. Anyway, even on these old Snap-ons, they did have a nicely machined anvil, even though we can see that the chrome is starting to peel off it. Nonetheless, cool old Snap-on. Snap-on is always cool to own, even if I don't buy any of their stuff new and wait until I randomly run into old stuff. It still is satisfying. It's also why I rarely run into it, because everybody else is like, ooh, Snap-on. One thing people you don't see as much of, is this par X. So for a while, what Snap-on did, kind of like what Blue Point is now, but instead they had just slightly cheaper tools known as par X. And as cheesy as it sounds, Snap-on was considered the excellence in hand tools. So par X was actually Snap-on's tools that were on par with Snap-on excellence. That is, from what I have read on some forums, that's the explanation why it was called par X. It is more cheaply made. We just have like kind of a simple handle, but nonetheless, it still has a similar type of anvil and is similarly built, just a little bit lighter duty. But if you ever run into these par X tools, know they are made by Snap-on. We have some more common ones. We have like the Power Built. This one I've had for a long time. It's actually held up pretty well. Back before O'Reilly's Auto Parts merged with Shucks and some of those other auto parts stores, the old Power Built tools were really pretty good, and this breaker bar certainly held up just fine. Have the AutoZone's older school Duralast breaker bar, same thing except for a chrome anvil. Nice friction in it, or nice amount of resistance, and just a nice clean regular use breaker bar. What else should we talk about here? Maybe my very first one, which is this Mastercraft Pro. I've talked about these for a while. Fingerhut. In the late 90s and early 2000s, they were selling these Mastercraft Pro tools. Mastercraft is a big Canadian name brand for hand tools, but there was this period where they were making these Taiwanese Mastercraft Pros and were really trying to earn a good reputation. They were made to pretty high standards, and these things have just I mean, I've used this so much where I've actually worn off through the chrome, and it hasn't flaked. Not like the Snap-ons or the Protos or so many of those other professional brands. This is what you expect chrome plating to do, just to wear away, because it has a very strong bonding quality. Never broken this. It's been worth every cent. Holy smokes, I totally forgot about this. So after the right near when the Challenger name was going to be phased out, after Stanley had brought Proto tools, there was a very short period of the Stanley Challenger USA, and this Challenger versus these older ones that had a much stronger head, like a really beefy, wide head in there, really thick neck. It was much shorter, but it was like so many complaints of failed and warranty returns of the old ones that when they came out with this final American-made version, it was really, even though it was a shorter handle, it is way more beefed up. It was actually kind of weird. It was like the final battle cry of Challenger, and at least it was a decent one. Can't forget about Thorson tools coming out of Texas. They were the same thing. Started out, they were around for a long time. Started out, and were good quality tools, and then I don't know if they started losing quality and suffering sales losses and then sold out and then were even more cheapified. But that's eventually what happened. So they were American made, then they ended up being Taiwanese. But interestingly enough, the old American one is actually a surprisingly thin forks on it. It is not a particularly strong, but a lot of older tools, the idea was is they needed to be strong and serviceable, and a lot of times they were made them more compact, but you weren't expected to really put tons of force. It was like, you know, if it was too tight for a little breaker bar like this, and you'd end up using a bigger 1/2 inch one, and things migrated where everybody expected every tool size to do the work of any other tool size, and so they just beefed the tar out of it. I mean, this thing probably has twice as much steel in the head as this old school Thorson. Really aggressive knurling on it too. I do like that. Only have a couple of SKs. So what I have is an OG Diamond logo SK, and then I have an SK Wayne. That was the first buyout, was SK Wayne. And when they did that, they went from a swaged rivet on the original to a through pin on the revised one, and they thickened up the forks a little bit. Otherwise, a similar basic design, a little bit less handle on the SK Wayne, kind of like the bigger handle on the original SK. You'd think they'd both be exactly the same, but surprising amount of changes on the buyout, especially on what is like a kind of a basic tool. And they both have the same part number, 45153. You know, product subject to change without notice. I do have some random ones here. I picked up this one just because I saw it was Japanese made. Seeing, you know, it actually didn't have the machining. The slot wasn't cut very well centered, but figured why not? It seemed like a decent one. I kind of clicked up random ones. This is a very odd one that I did a video on recently. Once again, doesn't have the strongest kind of fork anvil setup because it's not a flared anvil. Flared is the term I've been looking for this whole time. Does say chrome vanadium on it. Nothing else. But this was the one that had, interestingly enough, was double-ended and had this, I think that was just a storage for another socket, where you put the same size in both in. I mean, I really was never able to understand why it has a square drive on the handle, a mail-in, but it does. And then, you know, as I mentioned before, there's been several American tools. This may be an Indestro or something like that, but this is a C34 made in USA, but once again, no branding, no stamping along there. You know, old school ones had through holes so you can hang them. Once again, it's just a breaker, particularly 3/8, just were not made, you know, to be super duty. I mean, that is a big difference on tools like this in the modern era. Like, here's this icon, and the head on this thing, this icon just absolutely dwarfs this, you know, just a simple, basic little made in USA one. Here's a rare brand of tools. This is our rare brand for hand tools, this old Bluegrass. They're really known for their axe heads. But there are Bluegrass hand tools, and a Kind of like the simple but straightforward design. It actually seems like it's a two-piece where this handle's been pressed onto the stem. Overall, the first and only bluegrass tool I've ever seen, and thought that was kind of cool. And I did find a few of these old, I mentioned this in some other videos, extensions and things. I did find some old Wright tools. Wright is one of the few companies that stayed private, never sold out, and resized. If they had drops in sales, they would reduce shifts and all the other necessary business practices to keep them going and surviving for decades and decades as an independent tool company. And there are still a few of them in the United States. Also, on these early Wright tools, 45 plus would mean that was made in the second half of 1945. So this would have been made probably just as World War II was ending. And that's what's kind of neat about having a tool like this, is it's kind of linked in history that this was manufactured the year the end of World War II. And it can be used as an extension. Isn't a new idea being able to do that. Wright tools have been doing it for nearly a century. Something that's really rare is these inverted anvils. So these inverted style anvils just give you a lot more steel around the fork area because it's integrated here. And it gives you just a really thick neck. And so this whole section is very unlikely to break. It would be these things spreading apart, maybe stripping out the threads. And so when you replace the head, you're also replacing the fork at the same time. Plus, it just gives it a lot of extra strength at the sacrifice of having kind of a taller and wider head. Hardly see that in 3/8, but this is a little Mac. Also can be used as an extension. And so as far as like the strongest head design, this little Mac takes the cake. This is one that has a little 3/8 breaker bar that you could stand on. And then last but not least, we'll talk about the Montgomery Ward. Have two different ones, a 56 and a 66 series. They have the same apparent part number, but I don't know if that's years of manufacture, 1956 and 1966, but Montgomery Ward had their Powercraft store brand, and the Powercraft hand tools were a lot better than the Powercraft branded power tools. There were some good Powercraft power tools, but the Powercraft hand tools, generally speaking, were a lot better. And I think, as far as I can tell, these are truly identical in every way. And one odd reason, even on the half-inch drive, they use these double-layer roll pins. I guess to act as a combination of a retention pin and, because the roll pin expands a little bit, it gives you the friction, the anti-swivel friction that these have. And figured it was probably strong enough, but if I ever use these and ever actually have issues with those roll pins, I'll just press them out and put in some solid dowel pins. But anyway, one thing about these is I really like the steep pyramid, high grip knurling. Knurling is my favorite because my hands always get greasy and dirty. Knurling just gives you a lot of extra traction. So anyway, that's my video about 3/8 breaker bars. A bunch of cool examples, and I always have fun being able just to kind of compare and show how, even though I have 30 of them here, and besides the icons being basically the same, even them with their handle differences, it's really surprising how much variety of hand tools. I mean, there's probably several hundred 3/8 breaker bars that you could end up getting, just different ones from different companies, different countries, and different eras. It's kind of the fun thing about collecting hand tools, is not just the variety, but the fact that they tend to stick around. People who run into hand tools at least tend to save them, unless they're really junky stuff. Less hand tools end up in landfills and getting thrown away because they're seen as useful items. And hand tools, generally speaking, have long lifespans. Not very many people actually break or wear out things like breaker bars. So they have a lot of staying power, and you can build up some neat little collections. Anyway, thanks for watching.